We are social creatures, and in order to secure relationships, whether we're talking romantic or platonic, we'll often compromise ourselves in order to fit other people's standards and expectations. We want to fit in, to belong, to be accepted and validated. We want others to like us, to love us. And whether we're conscious of it or not, we're constantly measuring their responses, seeing whether or not they approve of us, our behavior, our thoughts and opinions, our appearance, and so on. And we're constantly making adjustments to all of that in order to get a positive response, a response that says, I like you, I approve of you, I admire you, and so on. And it could be that our entire persona has been cultivated in this way, shaped and formed in order to fit the ideals of other people. And in becoming the person we think others would like us to be, we lose sight of who we really are. We might spend our entire lives like this, trying to be somebody else, working to create and maintain a false persona. And again, we may be totally unaware of it. For most people, it's completely unconscious. We don't even know that we're doing this. Most people don't realize this about themselves until they reach a point where they're so far removed from their authentic self that they don't recognize themselves at all. All of a sudden they realize that who they thought they were all their life is just a fiction, a lie. And in that moment of disillusion, they realize they don't know who they are at all. Some people may have a faint recognition of this once in a while. There's a sense that who they present themselves to be is not at all who they really are, but they avoid it. They quickly avert their attention away from looking at it because the sense of not knowing who you are can be deeply unsettling. Better to have a false sense of identity than no identity at all. But for those who have the courage to face that fear, to recognize that we aren't who we've come to believe we are, and who seek to discover their authentic self, to find out who they really are, that discovery can be extremely liberating. As long as we're dependent upon others for acceptance, for validation, approval, we're essentially slaves to them. We do their bidding. We do whatever is necessary to sustain their approval of us. We sacrifice who we are to become who they would like us to be. And we give them control not only over the way we behave, what we believe, how we present ourselves, and so on. We also give them control over how we feel. We make our happiness dependent upon their approval and their appraisal. And if they ever disapprove, we cannot be happy. And so in order to be happy, we do whatever we can to appease them, to keep their interest, to win their praise. But of course, this doesn't actually work because as long as we're concerned with whether or not they'll approve or whether or not we might lose them altogether, there's no peace. There's always fear. We're always worried, anxious, insecure. So we might have moments of happiness here or there, but most of the time we're unhappy because we're constantly afraid that we might do something that the other person won't approve of, or that we aren't doing enough already to please them, or that for some reason they might lose interest in us entirely and we'll be left alone. And then who will give us our approval? Who will validate us? To be alone for many people is a deeply disturbing and disparaging way to live. There's no one there to value us, to appraise us, to give us love, and to ensure us that we're worthy of it. And because we depend so desperately on others to provide these things, we can't stand to be alone. We might do anything not to be alone. We'll look for anyone who might offer us some attention. We may even be willing to settle for negative attention. At least it's still attention of some sort. At least someone notices us. They must see something of value within us. Otherwise, they'd have no interest at all. Sometimes we would rather be with anyone than be alone. Because to be alone means that there's no one to love us, no one to value us, no one to accept and approve of us. And without someone's approval, it's as if we have no value at all. But what if we didn't depend on someone else to approve of us, to accept us, and to offer us a sense of value? What if we could recognize value within ourselves without having to be reminded by someone else? What if we could appreciate the person we are, our various qualities and characteristics, regardless of whether anyone else does? And what if our happiness did not depend on anyone else or any external circumstance? What freedom we would have. When we depend on others for approval, it takes only one thing said or done to cause us a great deal of sadness and suffering. But imagine that you accept yourself so deeply, so fully, that nothing anyone else says affects you. What power there is in that, what peace there is. So how do we get that? How do we cultivate this level of self-acceptance and independence? We have to begin by facing ourselves, which is exactly what we've been avoiding this whole time. So much of our need to connect with others, to find companionship and so on, is a desperate attempt to avoid facing ourselves. Everyone seems to have this innate desire to know themselves, yet so few are willing to actually find out. And this is why we try to create an identity, so that we can have some sense of who we are. But as I already explained, the identity we create is a false persona based on other people's standards and expectations. It's created in order to please others, according to what others approve of, what others want, what others like and expect. So it's a complete fabrication. If you really want to know yourself, you have to put all that aside. You have to be willing to accept yourself just as you are. And that includes all the things which others may not find acceptable. This means suspending all judgment and just looking with real honesty and clarity. And that's a challenge for many of us, to look honestly at ourselves without judgment. But if we take a moment to just look at the judgment itself, we might realize that the judgments that we have about ourselves are not really our own judgments at all. Mostly they're other people's judgments that we've adopted as if they're our own. And some of these judgments are just imaginary. We imagine how people judge us, or how they might judge us, if they only knew what we were really like, what we really thought. Because it's a good chance that there are many things about us that we've gotten very skilled at hiding. Most of us have two personas, one public and one private. The way that we present ourselves to others may be far different than how we are when we're alone, or who we are inside of our own heads. And what we express openly may be far different than what we really think and feel. And if this is true about you, then just imagine how many other people this might also be true about. The reality may be that no one you know is who they present themselves to be. It could be that everyone is putting on a show to some degree, exaggerating their best qualities while desperately trying to hide their flaws. And the truth is that everyone has flaws and imperfections, despite how things may appear. And this is very important to understand, because so much of the condemnation that we place upon ourselves comes from a sense that we're the only one who has these imperfections. We're the only one who makes mistakes, or feels inadequate, or insecure, or whatever it may be. We tend to judge ourselves primarily in comparison to others, which means that if we compare who we are in private to how others appear in public, it's going to be very imbalanced. Naturally, we're going to feel inferior. But when we recognize that everyone has their own flaws and imperfections, their own sense of inadequacy and insecurity and so on, suddenly we're no worse off than they are. And if we can accept this reality, that no one is perfect and that most people deep down are struggling with the same issues that we are in some regard or another, then we can also accept this about ourselves. At the same time, we have to recognize that everyone also has something of value, some positive qualities and characteristics. And you have to be able to recognize those within yourself, and also to recognize the value of such qualities without any outside opinion. This means that it doesn't matter if anyone else recognizes it. Can you recognize it? It doesn't matter whether or not someone else values it. Do you see the value of it? Can we become independent of other people's opinions and judgments? Can we become free from the influence others have on what we think, what we say, and how we behave? Can we be truly authentic, true to who we are? This is where solitude becomes so important. We avoid being alone because we're avoiding ourselves. But when we're willing to see into ourselves, being alone offers us the space to go more deeply. In solitude, we have no one to impress, no one to approve or disapprove of us. We don't have to be concerned with whether we're going to be accepted, whether our thoughts or words, our appearance or behavior is acceptable. In solitude, we have the freedom to think and act naturally. In solitude, our attention is not drawn away from ourselves and onto others. We can look more deeply into ourselves, coming to know ourselves more clearly and honestly. And the more time that we spend alone, the deeper we can go. The more we come to accept ourselves, to find value in ourselves, while at the same time dissolving the judgments that we've adopted from others, the less dependent we are on others for our sense of worth. The more authentic we can be, even in the company of others. Solitude allows us to break the chains of that dependency, to be liberated. And when we no longer depend upon others to validate us, we no longer depend on them for our happiness. We can be happy even if the other disapproves of us, because we've taken that power back into our own hands. And as far as love is concerned, what we call love is often nothing more than validation and acceptance. But when we have accepted ourselves and come to realize our own intrinsic value, from that, love also arises. We no longer depend on others to love us. We love ourselves enough. And in that, there is so much freedom. In our desperation to be loved, we become a slave to others. We're willing to tolerate all kinds of disrespect just to feel a little bit of affection. And when we depend on someone else to love us, there's always the fear of losing that love. So there's never really any peace. There's always a deep sense of insecurity. But when you love yourself fully and authentically, there's no fear of losing someone else's love because you don't depend on it. You have your own source. And love becomes about sharing rather than desperately trying to get or to hold on to. The irony is this, that the more content you are with being alone, the more deeply you can love the other, because there's no fear of being alone. There's no fear of losing the other person. Fear stifles love. It contaminates it. Where there's fear, there's also tension. And where there's tension, there will be conflict. And this is why so many relationships fall apart. But when one is content to be alone and love is arising from within, there's no fear. You can be relaxed. And from that relaxed state, everything flows freely and naturally. The relationship becomes about sharing without any need for anything in return, because you already have everything you need within you. But to discover that, it helps to spend some time alone. It helps to be in solitude. To anyone who's alone already, who feels even the slightest sense of desperation to find someone, I would advise to simply sit with that and look at it. What is that resistance? And rather than indulging it or trying to escape it, can you simply observe it? Can you come to understand it? Can you let go of it and relax into that space of aloneness? I'm telling you this, and you can believe it or you can choose not to believe it. But if you cannot be at peace with yourself, you cannot be at peace with anyone. If you cannot be happy alone, you will never be happy with anyone. If you cannot love yourself fully and unconditionally, you will never love anyone fully, nor will you ever feel fully loved. If you cannot accept yourself as you truly are, you will never feel fully accepted. But I'm also telling you this, which you can also believe or disregard, that acceptance and validation, love and happiness and peace are all available within you already. And when you come to realize this, you will discover a freedom like no other. If you find this content valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.